So for this little mini lecture, we're dealing with evolution. We're talking about the mechanisms of evolution for chapter 12. It's been a moment since we've discussed evolution. We've defined the term evolution before and defined natural selection. So this time around, we're going to go back to natural selection and talk about the different patterns of natural selection and introduce the term convergent evolution and talk about how evolution comes about, kind of what are the different methods that contribute to evolution, or what we call the mechanisms of evolution. And so that includes natural selection, mutations, and talking about gene flow and genetic drift. So first off, let's talk about alleles. So this is kind of nice in the fact that we're pulling together a lot of the information that we've been talking about all semester long. So if you remember during genetics, we talked about alleles and that a genotype consists of 2 alleles. So if we were talking about plants, it may be a tall plant and a short plant. And we said tall could be dominant and short could be recessive. And if an individual had a tall and a short allele, they would be heterozygous. So these are the same alleles that we're talking about here. So we referred to an allele as a variation in a gene. So it's just a slightly different way in which that nitrogenous base sequence is encoding information to bring about a slightly different phenotype, whether it's black pigment or brown pigment, whatever it is. So alleles are just different versions of a gene. And these different versions come about by mutations, which we'll discuss next. So if we're looking at this population here, we've got mice, we've got brown mice, and we've got white mice. And if we count up all the mice in the population, there are about 15 mice. Now each mouse, if we're looking at a particular trait, has 2 alleles for that trait. So for this brown one, we say it has kind of a brown pigment allele and a white allele, whereas the white mice have 2 white alleles. So if we're looking at the frequency of the alleles, so what about the frequency of the white allele? If we count our white mice, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each one has 2 alleles, one that was inherited from the mother's side, one from the father's side. So that would be 10 white alleles. And then we see in our brown mice, we have 1, 2, 3 alleles there. So that gives us a total of 13 alleles. And we said we have 15 mice and each mouse has 2 alleles. So that's out of a total of 30 alleles. So if we take 13 and divide it by 30, that would give us about 43%. So 43% of the population shows the white allele. And then from there, we can just subtract from 100% to find out what is the frequency of our brown allele. So that would be 57%. So for this chapter, we're going to be looking at the allele frequencies, as it says, the proportions of the specific alleles in the population. And for evolution, we're going to be seeing that the population evolves, or they're evolving, when we see changes in these allele frequencies. So this is kind of what we call microevolution. We're looking at it at a very small scale. So when we talked about evolution, we said evolution is a change in a population over time. And now we're getting down to what do we mean by a change? How do we know the population has changed? So this change refers to how prevalent these alleles are. So within this population, we know it's 57% brown and 43% white. But what if these percentages shift over generations and change? And maybe that's due to the fact that the environment is changing. And that's why we see changes in the allele frequencies. So these shifts in allele frequencies are what we're looking for when it comes to evolution. Because once again, we've said all along that it's the population that evolves, not the individual. So an individual might have a characteristic or a new allele or a mutation, I should say, that may arise, but it's only if we see that new mutation or that new allele spreading through the population that we can say evolution has occurred. So if we see the frequency of that new allele increasing, then we can say evolution has occurred. Okay, so by tracking allele frequencies, scientists can study how populations adapt to changing environments. So we're going to be talking about 4 mechanisms that help to drive evolution: natural selection, mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. So the first 2 we've kind of mentioned before, and the last 2 are going to be new ones. So let's talk about natural selection again. So we've already discussed natural selection and how individuals with advantageous traits get to reproduce, right? They get to survive. They survive being eaten. They find mates, and they pass on their traits to the next generation. And therefore, the frequencies of their alleles will tend to increase in the population. We've also talked about the peppered moth example, and we saw that that these moths like to attach to tree bark, and some of them are camouflaged depending upon their pigments. So here they're showing that during the Industrial Revolution, we've got the light-colored moth and the dark-colored moth, and we had said that during the Industrial Revolution, the soot from all the factories darkened the bark of the trees, and the darker colored moths were the ones that were better camouflaged and therefore not detected by predators, and they survived and got to pass on that dark pigment to the next generation, whereas the lighter colored moths could easily be picked off by predators and were eaten, and therefore not as many survived, and therefore you don't see as many light-colored moths because they were not reproducing. So this is an example of what we call directional selection. So directional selection is a form of natural selection in which one extreme phenotype is favored over other phenotypes. So directional selection steadily shifts the population's characteristics toward one end of the spectrum. And that's what we're seeing here in this graph, is the line kind of shifts towards one side and it's going towards the darker colored moths. So it's increasing as we go to the darker color. The frequency of the dark pigment allele is increasing in that population. Now, we also saw with the Industrial Revolution that the environment changed. So once they started to install pollution devices and not as much soot was released into the air, that the bark of the trees became lighter colored again. And so now the darker moth is the one that stood out. The lighter colored moth, you can barely see right there, is the one that was better camouflaged. The lighter colored moths survived, they reproduce, they pass on that lighter color pigmentation to the next generation. Darker ones do not survive as much, and therefore we don't see them in as much. Their alleles are declining. So now in our graph, we see an increase in the light colored moths and a decline in the darker colored moths. Right? So this is what we mean by directional selection, either one direction or the other direction. The extreme phenotype is what's being favored. And we can see this when antibiotics are used, right? When you use an antibiotic, most bacteria die, but those that might have a rare mutation to be resistant to that antibiotic are the ones that survive. They reproduce, and over time the population shifts towards antibiotic resistant forms. We could say the same thing with pesticide resistance in insects. When pesticides are applied, insects with genetic traits that help them to survive the exposure, they get to reproduce, and that's shifting the population toward the more resistant individuals. So the ones with the alleles that encode for that resistance are the ones that are favored. So once again, seeing our allele frequencies shift and it's shifting to one extreme or the other. We have another pattern of natural selection, and that's called stabilizing selection. So this is a type of natural selection that favors intermediate phenotypes and acts against extreme variations of a trait. And this occurs when individuals with average characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce than those at either extreme. So as a result, the population becomes more uniform over time. Now, one example of stabilizing selection is human birth weight. So infants of moderate weight have actually a higher survival rates than very small or very large infants, right? So obviously being born underweight is not very good, but also we see at the other end of the spectrum on our graph that the higher weights do not increase the survivability of the infants. So stabilizing kind of that intermediate trait is what's favored. And we might see this with plants as well, that plant height can make a difference. So extremely tall plants may be damaged by wind and they might fall over a lot easier. This is actually called lodging when these tall plants fall over and they get damaged. While very short plants may receive too little sunlight. They might be shaded out by other plants. So intermediate height plants often have the best survival chance. We can also talk about clutch size in birds. Birds that lay too few eggs may not pass on enough offspring, while those that lay too many eggs may not be able to adequately feed all those chicks. There's just too many mouths to feed, and that becomes a problem. So the intermediate clutch size is often favored. And our last type of natural selection pattern is disruptive selection. So this is a form of natural selection in which individuals at both extremes of a trait are more successful than those with intermediate traits. So the population is split into two distinct phenotypic groups. And this often occurs when the environmental conditions vary in a way that favors very different adaptations, or when resources are divided into separate niches. So as a result, the intermediate phenotype is usually at a disadvantage. So the classic example is birds, right? So birds that benefit from either very large beaks. So in this case, we have African seed crackers, and we're looking at the graph here, and it talks about the width of the lower beak in millimeters. So we see around 12 millimeters, right? And then we also have around, maybe about 15 millimeters there. So we're looking at birds that have very large beaks are able to crack the tough seeds, or birds with very small beaks for handling the soft seeds, while medium-sized beaks are inefficient at both tasks, right? They're not very good at handling the smaller seeds, but they can't also crack the larger seeds. So the extremes on one end or the other end are what's being favored. We also can look at the example of salmon. So in salmon, very large males can fight for a mate. They're fighting for the chance to reproduce with a female. So the large males will be fighting amongst each other. And while they're fighting, the much smaller males, they're called sneaker males, they can sneak in or slip in and fertilize the eggs while the other males are fighting. If it's a medium-sized male salmon, then they're not very successful because a lot of times the larger males might pick a fight with the medium-sized males, and they're still too big to be able to sneak in without going unnoticed. So disruptive, once again, is kind of both ends of the spectrum are favored, right? The two extremes are favored in this case.